For the Jewish people at the time of Jesus, the temple, there was only one temple and it was in Jerusalem, was a very important place. Within the temple, there was a very special presence of God. It was a sacred place. Actually, even the high priest would only go into one of the parts of the temple only once a year because of God's presence there and the sacredness of that place. And also, it was at this temple where a lot of sacrifice was offered. They would bring animals, right, and be offered in sacrifice to God to give Him worship, to honor Him. And this would be especially the case in big Jewish festivals. So this means that during big Jewish festivals, like the Passover, when a lot of people would go to Jerusalem, tons of animals would be brought to the temple and tons of sacrifices would be done there inside the temple. This also means that a lot of animal blood was generated at the temple during this Jewish feast because of all the animal sacrifices that were happening there offered to God. Due to this, the temple actually was designed in such a way that it had certain ducts, like almost like some sort of like plumbing system, in order to be able to kind of have the blood kind of leave the temple, right? Because there was a lot of animal sacrifices happening. And so, during the festival seasons, when tons of Jews would go up to Jerusalem and they would be approaching Jerusalem, approaching the temple, you would see the temple, and then to one of the sides of the temple, you would see a little stream of blood flowing from the temple, right? Kind of like a little river, a stream of blood flowing to the temple from all the blood that was being produced from the animal sacrifices. And all would see these, right? I'm going to come back to this here in a second. The Old Testament, we also have a vision of a new temple. You may recall that Ezekiel had this vision, a prophecy of a new temple that God was going to give. And in this vision that Ezekiel is having, he sees the temple, and to the side of the temple, he sees a stream of water flowing from the side of the temple. And this little stream is really small at the beginning, but he starts following the stream, and as he follows this stream begins to become bigger and bigger and bigger to the point that it becomes a huge river that he can hardly kind of cut across of this huge river, how big it is. And Ezekiel notices too that along the sides of this river, there's just tons of just flourishing. A lot of plants growing, trees that have a lot of good food. And he notices too that the leaves of these trees flowing that are growing besides this river are good for medicine. This is a vision that Ezekiel had and about a new temple that God was going to give them. Let's now talk about Jesus for a second. When our Lord was crucified, as we know, He was pierced on His side with a lance. What happened after He was pierced? Blood and water flowed from His side. A river flowed from His side. Those who saw the Lord being pierced, or those who read or heard about it soon after, when they saw this, they immediately recognized this imagery of the temple flowing with blood and water. And they saw in Jesus the new temple. We know Jesus claimed to be God Himself. A presence of God much more intense than the presence that was found in the old temple. Jesus is God incarnate. A way greater quote-unquote temple is God Himself. And even He Himself referred to Himself as a temple. You may recall when He goes to the temple once and says, destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. And people were kind of mocking Him. And then John clarifies, He was speaking about the temple of His body. Jesus saw Himself as a new temple, as a new presence of God. And when He was pierced, there was blood and water flowing from His side. And another just kind of ratification of the truth of He being the true temple. Now what happens with this vision of Ezekiel, right, of this new temple, who is Jesus, with water flowing from His side? What does this water do? It is life-giving. It makes all these plants grow. It gives good food. It gives leaves for healing. which of course means that the mercy flowing from the side of the Lord, the love of His sacrifice is what nourishes us. You know, the early church fathers, especially John Chrysostom, writes, when you see the blood and water flowing from the side of Jesus, what you see there are really just a representation of the baptism flowing from the side of Jesus, the waters that regenerate us, that wash us, that cleanse us. And then you see in His blood flowing from His side the Eucharist that nourishes and heals us. It is from the side of the Lord that we, in a sense, receive the sacraments. And every time we encounter the sacraments, every time we are baptized, we are reminded of our baptism, like earlier today, when we eat the blood and body of our Lord, we are nourished with the very life of Jesus, the mercy of Jesus flowing from His side. 2, John Chrysostom talked about how if it is indeed the case that the sacraments are kind of flowing from the side of Jesus, from His very love and mercy, then too the church, in a sense, is born from the side of Jesus. And he talks about this really interesting parallel. You go back to Genesis, what happened in Genesis? God created Adam and Eve. And how did He create Eve specifically? After God had created Adam, He put Adam in a deep sleep. And while Adam was asleep, God, from the side of Adam, in this deep sleep, takes his rib and forms his wife, Eve. And so it is the case too, that when Christ was in a deep sleep, that is, when He was dead on the cross, God the Father fashioned from His side Jesus' bride, the church. It is the church that is born through the side of the Lord, and it is the sacraments that are born from the side of the Lord, and it is through the church and the sacraments that we encounter Jesus' own love and mercy, His healing blood, His healing water of baptism. It is important that we approach these mysteries that God has given us, His sacraments and His church, with great faith. With great faith in their healing power, in their nourishing power, because indeed they are the way in which we encounter the Lord, or a way in which we encounter the Lord. So let me just conclude with a couple of thoughts on faith. Faith can be difficult, whether it's faith in the church, in the sacraments, and just in general in the resurrection of the Lord, or whatever it may be. The mysteries are just very deep, and it can be difficult sometimes. Thomas is a good example of the difficulty. He doubted. He couldn't believe that indeed the Lord was risen. But it's not only Thomas. Actually, if you read the other accounts of the resurrection, the other disciples doubted too, even after they had seen the resurrected Lord. They think they're seeing a ghost, even though they're actually seeing Him in the flesh. It's hard for them to believe. But it's beautiful, the mercy that God has on anybody who struggles with faith, and on Thomas himself. You know, Thomas doubts, and it's not like the Lord immediately just says, well, go away, Thomas, and rejects him. No. He meets him where he's at. Right? Meets him where he's at and draws him to have a deeper faith and to be able to exclaim, my Lord and my God. As Thomas has struggles with his faith, Jesus does not reject him, but quite the contrary. He meets him where he's at and draws him closer to Himself. And so we can be hopeful that the Lord does the same with us. As we struggle perhaps to grasp the depth of the mysteries, the depth of the resurrection of the Lord, as maybe we don't understand why God is doing or allowing something to happen in our lives, we can ask Him to increase our faith. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And He will hear our prayer and answer it like He approached Thomas, and He will help us to believe. He will draw our hearts to see the truth of who He is, and to be able to have a great conviction looking at Him and be able to exclaim with true and deep faith, my Lord and my God.